And as mentioned before, I've had a bit of a history, especially locally. Now, in the late 1970s and the 1980s, paganism was a growing thing. It was going through a kind of renaissance. And what was happening was that people were getting more and more interested in it, but there was nowhere you could actually become part of it. I mean, in Sheffield or Yorkshire area, you had Pat Crowther, who was a Gardnerian. And it was very difficult to get involved with the Gardnerian coven. Very difficult indeed. The other alternative was, of course, Alexander's. All you had to do is to get yourself down to London and you could join his conveyor belt initiations, which was quite good of him, but it was difficult for many people in Manchester to actually be involved with a working group. Until, as I discovered, I met Barbara Brandolani. And basically, I was working on a farm in Cheshire, just outside Congleton, and I'd been doing some work there, animism work, with the people who ran the farm. And when I came back to Manchester, I was looking for an opening, another path to get involved in. I eventually met up with some people who lived in Eccles, who ran a magazine called Ignews, which was an Earth Mysteries magazine. And they pointed out at one meeting an old newspaper, the Middleton Guardian, of the shop that had opened in Failsworth called the Witchery. And they said, do us a favour, for our magazine, will you go and have a look at this place, check this woman out, see what this shop is all about. And I said, I'll do that. I'll go down and I will expose this charlatan. I will take her to the cleaners. I will point out everything that is wrong with her. And it's obviously just a money-making scam. So one Saturday, I toddled off to Failsworth and popped in to the shop. And there I met the woman whose face I'd seen on the newspaper, Barbara Brandolani. Pass that around if you like, and people have a look at her. Now, Barbara lived in New Moston, and she'd opened this shop because she had an interest in witchcraft, and she wanted to get it out there. She wanted to get it into the public domain because, like I say, there were no places you could really go. I went to the shop and I sort of like, she looks like a very archetypal witch. She's got the look, she's got the dark hair, she's got the black clothing. She looks the part, but doesn't make her a witch. She just looks the part. And I left the shop. I bought a few things. I left the shop and I felt that I had to go back for some reason. And I did. I went back about an hour later. And Barbara sort of said, you seem interested in this. And sort of like, no, really. Said, come to my place next week. I'll give you my address. Come to our house next week. And I thought, this is interesting. Very well, I will. And a week later was my first experience of what was to become the Hermetic Order of the Silver Blade. Now, Barbara's house is a very large house in New Moston called Raven's Leach, of all things. And I was shown into, I went knocked on the door, I was shown in and escorted into this large room, which she called the tarot room. And there was about 20 other people in there, all doing the same thing that I did. They wanted to be involved with something, and they had got the invite. And that was quite an eventful moment for me to sort of see this room. And I don't know if you can imagine, it's got all occult decor around it. Very, very atmospheric. And immediately after we'd all settled down, we'd all been given a glass of wine, Barbara's son, Gino, swept into the room and sort of said, hello, you're all here to learn magic. And I say magic with a K. I was sort of like, okay, I'm seeing some theatrics here. I'm not buying it. And then Barbara was ushered in. And Barbara is a very strong, yet fairly quiet person. And she came in and she thanked everybody for coming and sort of said, here's my story very briefly. I have a handicapped son. He's not been given much of a life, and we were told that he would not last 3 years, but he was still there after 6 years. I said, I'm raising some healing energy for him. So tonight, straight away, without any fuss, we're going to open a circle and we're going to raise energy, and we're going to raise a cone of power to help my son. If you're all into agreement with that. I said, everyone was in agreement. And we did. And all I can say is that the energy raised in the room that night was so potent that at least 2 people staggered away from the circle. And I have to admit, I was one of them. It was a very powerful experience for me. And Barbara eventually closed the circle down and started chatting to us, talking about how she is very much into the idea of bringing witchcraft and paganism into the general public, and to get rid of all those little bits of dogma that groups like the Gardnerians had and the Alexandrians had, and even to a degree some of the more Kabbalistic occultists had. And so we're all very interested, and we all left the room. And as we all went out the house, Bob would say to them, lovely to see you, thank you, good night. And every so often they come to somebody and say, thank you for coming, lovely to see you, good night, come back next week. And I was one of those people who came back this week. About 6 of us came back the next week. And thus the circle began to become established. Now, Barbara had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the press and the media. It was a necessary evil that she had to put up with. Following her shop opening in Failsworth, she got a lot of people interested. And of course, like I say, people had come to the house and word had gotten out that she was doing stuff. And this continued to grow until eventually she whittled down all the people that had been brought back till there was a core membership, about 8 of us, and we became a group. And Barbara wanted a name for the group. And when you think of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, you think, big ceremonial magicians, all the fancy garb, all the big temples. We became the Hermetic Order of the Silver Blade, who had none of that. We had what Barbara would say, a working mentality. This was a group that was intent on working, doing stuff, not just getting together once a week to sort of, as she called it, Saturday night knife wavers. That we want this to do something to help people, and also to bring understanding to the general public about what we do as pagans. Now, to say Barbara was a bit of an oddity is a bit of an understatement. She was very, very much her own person, and she had a family of 7 children living in this house, and they were all wonderful kids. And what happened was, as I said earlier, the press got interested and they called her up, and they kept coming round and they kept asking her for interviews and so on and so forth. But Barbara was not really interested in that. What she was interested, like I say, was getting the word out to the general public and making paganism acceptable and amenable for all the people in the locality. As such, she started doing things. She had tarot readings, she had open evenings, she had open rituals. And what happened with her was that she got a little seduced by the dark side of the press. And a lot of the time, she was being dragged out to be interviewed on television, radio, everything. Paper, you go to the newspaper at the time. I just spent 7 days going through a newspaper archive, and the amount of stuff that was there about Barbara is unbelievable. And it ranges from being part of a Crown Court trial about a woman who was trying to use her to commit murder by magic, Then there is also a very interesting one which got the headlines quite universally, which was when in 1984 she discovered that her house was not in very good shape. Foundations were crumbling, and the work needed to save the house was going to be huge and very expensive. So she decided that it was time to look for a new place, and with a family of 7 children and her husband and several animals, including ducks, snakes, dogs, cats, parrots. I can't remember all the rest of them. There's a lot of animals there, peacocks. She needed a large place, and she found what she thought was the ideal home for her family, which would also couple as an excellent place for a pagan temple. Hence came the story of Slack Chapel in Heptonstall. In 1984, she put in a bid to try and buy an old deconsecrated church because it had lots of rooms and she had 7 children and animals, and she wanted it. It was cheaper than saving the house. Immediately, the press took it up and the locals took it up, and there became a battle between the local Christians and Barbara. Now, Barbara, like I say, she did say that she wanted a temple there. She liked the idea of using that space as a sacred area for any pagan groups or occult groups who would like to use it. But the main priority was housing her children. And it became a bit bitter. It became very bitter. And in the end, she lost the bid, mainly because of a bit of input from Cliff Richard, which she was never pleased about. And I think the fact that he didn't have much of a success after that was partly because of how some people thought about him. I thought so too. But at this stage now, Barbara was becoming headline news all over the place. And the sad thing what was happening also at the time was the satanic child abuse scare, the whole flat there. And bear in mind, you have this woman who is very openly a witch, very outspoken, very public, and has 7 children. 5 of those are at school age. Then became a big battle for not just her children, but for everyone else who'd been involved in satanic child abuse scare. She worked closely with the civil liberties organisations to stop this thing happening, and she was having great difficulties with various clergymen, politicians, social workers. And it's to her credit that her children were untouched by it. And she had a great deal to say about what happened in Rochdale, the whole Rochdale thing. And I'd like to think that she had some effect with her words on that. The only thing that she did have an issue with was on Halloween, her young daughter, Sammy, who was I think she was about 8 at the time, had gone to school and they were doing all sorts of Halloween stuff. And the teacher had told Sammy that witches didn't exist, which is pretty hard to sort of fathom when your mother is pretty much a headline witch and no one is denying the fact that she exists. But she was fine with it. She had a laugh and it was all good fun. Barbara was all about having fun, but she was also way ahead of her time in the way she was thinking of things. I mean, the idea of having an actual physical temple was frowned upon by a lot of Wiccans and pagans at the time, who thought that everything should stay underground and you shouldn't make waves and you shouldn't do this. Barbara was not going to listen to them. She did not believe in secrecy. She did not believe in a lot of things that the major covens like the Gardnerians or the Alexandrians were saying. That you have to be initiated, you have to have this, you have to do that, you have to believe in this. Barbara wiped the floor with that, and she became, in many ways, the first animistic, eclectic witch of the time. It was a new thing. These sort of people didn't really exist in the open at that stage. And she would go, and she said in one magazine interview, sort of, that magic is like cooking. It's like cookery. You take various ingredients together, put them together, mix them up, put them out there, and you get a cake or a result. Magic would be. And that's what she did. She refused to give gods or goddesses names. To her, there was that duality. There was the goddess and the god. She wouldn't say, Odin. She wouldn't say Freya. She'd say, he's the gaffer and she's the matron. That's all you need to know. We got a god and a goddess. That's it. We don't need to name anything, but we can use any instrument that is available to us, whether that be African magic, voodoo, ceremonial magic, and just animism, because she loved her animism. She loved being out there with nature, with animals, and she was way ahead of her time, and yet she was pilloried, not just by the church, not just by, well, the press didn't pillory her, they liked her, the press loved her, but a lot of pagans did, and a lot of Christians did, with the exception of one chap who was an Anglo-Catholic priest in Balesworth, who joined the coven. He actually saw something in Barbara that was special, and he could attune himself to it, and he could understand where she was coming from. She also had visits from Trisha Crowther's high priest, Leon Dickens, who came over and wanted to join her group as well. Barbara was fine with accepting Gardnerians in, but she had the rule, sort of, you can come in as a Gardnerian, but don't expect us to do Gardnerian stuff. You are not us. We are what we are. And he was fine with that, but sadly, he didn't last long. He became very ill a couple of years afterwards and was unable to actually attend any meetings. But it was always good to see that someone in the main Wiccan mainstream was paying attention and actually agreeing with what Barbara was doing. Doreen Valiente was doing it through her book. She was doing, here's a self-initiation, self-dedication rite you can do for yourself. You don't need to be initiated. You can go into the land and work with the nature. But the main covens had their own dogma, and they didn't like somebody taking away that dogma and saying, anyone can do this. You want to do magic? We can do magic. And we did. We did a lot of magic. And that was what the wonderful thing was. So she failed with her idea of getting the temple. She failed, but it did a world of good for a great many estate agents. If an estate agent had an old deconsecrated church which they wanted to sell, they'd offer it to Barbara first because they knew their controversy would sell it. And she tried not to get involved with that. And eventually she'd raised enough money to actually pay for the house to be repaired. So after a couple of years, it didn't matter anymore. Well, word of her endeavours got out, and a guy called Stephen Malatrap, who's a playwright, he did a lot of work for TV, Coronation Street, and various things. He wrote a play based on her situation with the Heptonstall Church called Touch Wood and Whistle, which premiered in Scarborough and went around a few venues. Barbara loved that. She loved the idea that she was the centre of a play, and she liked everything about it, even though it was a comedy, and she thought it was great. She said the only thing wrong with the play is that the main character in it actually gave up. She said, but I never gave up. I continued fighting. And she did indeed. Sadly, in 1995, her husband Mario died, and it was a bit of a blow for Barbara. Most of the group by that time had fallen away. Even myself, I'd moved to Essex originally, and then I moved to Brighton. But I came back to visit one week, and it was always the same. It was like I'd never left. 2 years between visits, and we were back to normal. And after her husband died, I went round then, and the place was an empty shell. Ravens Leach was a bit of an empty house. The children had mainly moved out, with only a couple of the daughters still living there. And Barbara wasn't a whole self. She still had that spark, but there was nothing happening. And I went back to Brighton, sort of wrote an article about it for the magazine, and out of the blue, about 3 years later, I got an email from her daughter saying, hi, scribe, because I was a scribe. She made me a scribe, I should have mentioned that. And all the daughters used to call me scribe. Said, hi, scribe, how are you doing? Would you like to go to Italy? I said, yeah, I'd love to go to Italy. What? And they said, well, Mum's sold up the house, and she's moved to Italy now, in Tuscany, a place called Givezzano. And I thought, that's great, that's wonderful, that sounds wonderful. How did you get in touch? Because you never knew my email address. They never knew my email address because we didn't have one last time I saw her. And somehow her daughter had traced me somehow through the magazine and various mentions of it, and got an email and messaged me for this. And basically, Barbara had moved over to Tuscany and wanted to come back to visit her son, who was handicapped and in care. And she wanted somebody to go out there and look after her animals. Okay, I'll do that. People in Brighton thought I was mad. I was going out to Italy, not knowing where I was going, not knowing anybody there, on the whim of one email sort of saying, would you like to go to Italy? And I said, yes. And I went over there, and after a bit of messing about, and there was a little bit of messing about, I stayed in Italy for a while. And whilst I was there, I got involved with the Strega, the Italian witchcraft scene then. Very special time it was for me. And it was ironic that Barbara was never part of the Italian rural tradition. She had almost given up on magic. She'd gone into a retirement, which seemed reluctant, but she was still there, fully conscious, in a magical mind, being able to continue saying how she hated how the modern paganism had gone with the rules and regulations and so on and so forth. And she felt a little bit dejected, which I can kind of understand, because she was a bit of a groundbreaker in her day. And it always seems sad to me that she had such a lot of bad press, especially, like I say, from the pagan world, for trying to do something which is now commonplace. Pride in being a pagan. Open about being pagan in public, going to pride, pagan pride, or events like that. And she was all for that. And I could go on and show you many, many newspaper cuttings about all her exciting, fun things that she did. Outdoor rituals at Daisy Nook, even marching to Manchester Town Hall and raising a pentagram flag over the town hall. Did some crazy things, not all of which I really agree with, but she wanted to make a point, and to do that she had to be loud and proud, and she was. Sadly, Barbara passed away in 2015. That was a very sad time for me. I found out by accident. Her daughter had posted something to one of the Italian members' friends, and I realised that it said Barbara, and it mentioned mortality in Italian. So I contacted her daughter, and she sort of said, yeah, sadly, Mum was over here. She basically caught sepsis and died. Very sad. And I went to the funeral, I gave a talk there, and real eulogy to say what a wonderful woman she was. And she was. Talis came over to Italy at one point and met Barbara, and it was quite a sad time because Barbara, while she was over there, she was sexually assaulted. She was raped over there, and she was going through a really hard time. And she would not stay at her house in Tuscany, but she still remained very upbeat and very positive despite that. When she died, I went to the funeral. I gave a talk. It's strangely a Catholic burial. It's a Catholic service and everything. Because Barbara was originally Irish and she had a lot of the Catholic in her. And she loved Catholicism because of the ritual. And a lot of the ritual from her Catholic roots have been incorporated into a lot of her works. You know, I saw her do some magic for a woman one day, and she'd made a sort of poppet out of dough to put in the bed, but she also blessed it with a Catholic blessing as well as using pagan incantations over it. And I always found it quite amusing. She sort of always said to me, no, Gaffer, matron, we're all the same. God, Mary, it's all the same. And she had no problem being able to mix her religious and spiritual beliefs with the people she was working with. She was one of the best tarot readers I'd ever met and one of the best teachers I've ever met. She taught me all the ins and outs of tarot, and she was always a very popular person when it came to people coming for a tarot reading. But it's her work that is never seen that is the most important. I mean, she worked for many people. People would come to her for help, and she never, ever turned anyone away. I had I don't know if I had good fortune or misfortune, depending on which way you look on it, to actually take on a lot of the people she helped afterwards, after she wasn't able to. So I've made some wonderful friends. I've still got very good friends who live in Mobley at the moment, or live. And these people have been ever so grateful because of the help they received from both her and by proxy by me as well. And she will always be remembered by many to be a media-seeking witch. But in actual fact, she was actually a force of nature and one who doesn't get the recognition she deserves. And so I am now in the process of writing a book about her life, about her work, which I'm hoping to get out in the next 7 or 8 months. Because while you have luminaries such as Richard Crowther, Alex Saunders, and all the other names out there, he was one who for one moment glowed and sparked up in the Manchester area and then slowly vanished. But her work never did. She always continued, despite the fact all that media attention faded away. And she made so many people into what they are today. So many magicians in and around Manchester learned a lot and took a lot from her teachings. And she was a fine, fine teacher. There are many anecdotes I could share, and I'm not going to, because I'm probably running out of time now. But and there's a book. And there's a book. If I gave the book away now, you wouldn't buy it. So I'd like to sort of share with you a thought that there are people out there who are unsung heroes of the pagan world who'd never get the recognition that they deserve, and Barbara was one of them. If anyone's interested in any of her stuff, there's a book called Weird Calderfield by Paul Weatherhead. That's got a full story about her battle with the Heptonstall Church. I, of course, mention her in Matter of the Stream, strangely only in passing. I could have, well, I'm writing another book. And another one by a guy called Andy Roberts, called Cat Flaps. Now you might say, what? Cat flats? And therein lies another little story. Between her losing the Heptonstall church, she actually vanished for a couple of weeks. Did a bit of a Christie, she just went away somewhere. At a time and at a place where a big cat started to be seen, a big black cat. And it's become sort of common knowledge for those who know that there was a cat which was known as the Rosendale creature. And the explanation was that Mrs. Barbara Brandolani was, and no doubt still is, a witch who at the time headed the coven in Manchester. At the time of the Rosendale Leiden saga, Mrs. Brandolani and her coven were attempting to buy an old Baptist church at Slack in Heptonstall, high on the moors up the Hepton Bridge in West Yorkshire. And later on, there was this black cat, and she has been credited for that. And I asked her about this. I said, come on, Barbara, what's all this about? Black cat, you turn into a cat? And she never said no, and she never said yes. The one thing we do know, that cat was only seen when she was missing. Take that as whichever way you will. But that's the mystery of Barbara. She is an enigma and someone you should learn more about. And when the book's done, you'll be able to. So thank you.